The human brain thrives on rhythm. It's not just a coincidence that we sleep in cycles, breathe in patterns, and when you do consistently and perform at our best when routines are stable. At a neural level, the brain is constantly predicting what comes next. It uses prior patterns, especially those tied to time and repetition, to forecast outcomes, manage energy, and allocate focus. This is known as predictive processing, and it plays a central role in everything from motivation to mental clarity. When you start your week with intentional structure, you're not just organizing your schedule. You are giving your brain a reliable framework. And when your prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for goal setting, attention, and executive function, becomes more efficient when it can predict what's coming, this reduces uncertainty, and which in turn lowers baseline levels of cortisol and norepinephrine, two chemicals associated with stress and vigilance. A structured tells your nervous system, we know what's happening, we're safe, and we're in control. That psychological safety is not abstract, it is deeply physiological. Rhythmic behavior, especially when it occurs at the same time and in the same order, entrains what are called ultradian and circadian rhythms. And these rhythms govern your energy spikes, alertness, and even your capacity to learn. When you open your week with predictable actions, like waking at a consistent hour, moving your body, reviewing key goals, and when you do consistently and engaging in a focused task, you are essentially tuning your nervous system like a metronome. It learns to expect focus at that time. And over the course of a few weeks, the act of beginning your week in a certain way creates neurochemical anticipation. Dopamine begins to rise not just from the activity, but in anticipation of the activity. That's when you've built momentum into your biology. It's also important to understand how this impacts long-term focus. And when the brain encounters randomness early in the week, especially unstructured or emotionally chaotic stimuli like social media emails or last-minute decisions, it shifts into what's known as a reactive mode. The limbic system, particularly the amygdala, becomes more active, which can suppress prefrontal function. That means your ability to plan, focus, and resist distraction is chemically compromised. But if you begin your week with pattern and predictability, you flip that switch in the opposite direction. The brain feels safe, focused, and when you're in command. The compound effect is profound. If every week starts with even 60 and 90 minutes of structured behavior, and the cumulative impact on cognitive control, emotional stability, and goal-directed action is measurable. And you create a sense of agency, not by accident, but through intentional rhythm. Your brain doesn't just notice patterns, it becomes them. Which is why when you consistently begin your week with structure, when you do consistently, you don't just get more done, you become the type of person who finishes what they start, not through willpower alone, but because your brain is now wired for clarity and long-range focus. And one of the most powerful, yet consistently overlooked, ways to recalibrate your brain and body at the start of every week is exposure to morning sunlight combined with light physical movement. These are not just feel-good habits. They are foundational biological triggers that reset your internal clock, regulate your energy systems, and elevate your dopamine baseline, the neurochemical that drives motivation, focus, and goal-directed behavior. Let's break this down from a physiological standpoint. Within your eyes, specifically, and in the retina, are specialized cells called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. These cells are tuned to detect sunlight, and when particularly blue light wavelengths that are most abundant in the first few hours of the morning. When exposed to this light, these cells send powerful signals to a brain region called the suprachiasmatic nucleus SCN, which is the master circadian pacemaker. This system sets your internal clock, not just for sleep, but for hormone release, mood regulation, cognitive sharpness, and metabolism. An early daylight exposure acts as a synchronizer. It tells every cell in your body, this is the start of the day. And this alignment is critical. If your circadian rhythms are misaligned, you may feel foggy, sluggish, or emotionally off, even if you've technically had enough sleep. And morning light resets that clock, leading to earlier, deeper sleep later that night and more consistent energy across the week. Done repeatedly, this becomes a biological anchor for clarity and momentum. Now add movement to this equation. You don't need an intense workout. Just walking, stretching, or cycling at a low intensity. When you combine light exposure with movement, you engage the body's locomotor system. When you do consistently, which in turn amplifies the dopamine response, movement increases blood flow to the brain, improves neurovascular coupling, and when activates brain areas linked to alertness and executive control. Importantly, and movement early in the day increases the sensitivity of dopamine receptors, meaning the same amount of dopamine will have a more powerful effect. What does this look like practically? Within 30 to 60 minutes of waking, step outside, even on cloudy days. The light intensity is far greater than indoor lighting. Spend 10-20 minutes in natural light while walking or performing gentle physical movement. This combination will elevate your cortisol pulse at the correct time of day, early morning, which enhances alertness and helps prevent the late day crashes that often derail productivity. This habit compounds. Over several weeks, your baseline dopamine levels rise, your sleep patterns stabilize, and your energy becomes more consistent. The brain learns that movement plus light equals readiness. You begin each week not in a fog of unpredictability, but with a neurochemical push toward clarity and drive. This is not motivational theory, it is biological leverage. You are training your nervous system to wake up, focus, and pursue. And once that circuitry is in place, you no longer have to force yourself into motion, you're already in it. One of the most underestimated tools for gaining control over your week, both mentally and behaviorally, is cognitive rehearsal. This is not just thinking about what you want to do. It's deliberately visualizing, predicting, and mentally simulating the steps and outcomes of your weekly goals. What may sound like a productivity hack is actually rooted in how the brain strengthens the neural circuits responsible for executive control, decision-making, and the suppression of impulsive behavior. Here's what happens at the neural level when you rehearse a task in your mind. You activate many of the same brain regions as if you were physically performing that task. This includes the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which manages planning and attention, the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors conflict and error, and even parts of the motor cortex. The act of mental simulation creates what's called prepotentiation in those circuits. It primes them. So when it comes time to actually engage in the task later, the brain isn't starting from zero. It's already been rehearsed. This saves energy, speeds up execution, and improves the likely to follow through. Cognitive rehearsal also impacts dopamine release. And when you visualize successful progress or imagine completing a challenging action, the brain anticipates reward. Dopamine is released not just when rewards are achieved, but when they are predicted. This prediction-based dopamine spike enhances motivation and sharpens focus, giving you an internal drive to move toward your rehearsed outcomes. You're essentially creating a neurological incentive system for your future self. This is especially critical at the start of the week. Most people open their Monday with stress and disorganization. That confusion signals threat to the limbic system, which ramps up reactive tendencies like procrastination, distraction, and emotional reactivity. But if you take 5-10 minutes at the beginning of your week to mentally walk through your top priorities, clearly, calmly, and in detail, you shift control back to the prefrontal cortex. That single act reduces cognitive noise and heightens signal clarity. You're not just thinking, you're encoding. Rehearsal strengthens the myelination around the neural circuits involved in task execution, much like physical practice does for athletes or musicians. Over time, repeated rehearsal improves working memory, narrows focus, and suppresses limbic urges that would normally pull your attention elsewhere. This is how impulse control is built, not by brute force or discipline, but by rehearsing success so clearly that the brain starts identifying with it. Practically, this means setting aside a few quiet minutes every Monday morning, or whenever your week begins, to run through your goals like a mental movie. Picture the steps, the obstacles, and the completion. Link it to why these goals matter to you long term. The clearer the rehearsal, Lee, the stronger the signal in your neural pathways. And when these circuits become dominant, distraction weakens and indecision fades. The brain is no longer negotiating with your intentions, it's executing them. Because now the plan is not just in your calendar. Lee, it's coded in your neural circuitry, one of the most critical, yet often ignored. The variables that shape how your week unfolds is your exposure to digital stimulation, especially during the first hour of the first day. The brain operates on limited attentional bandwidth. When you flood it early with fragmented, high stimulation input like social media, emails, notifications, or news, you're hijacking your own neurobiology. You are quite literally exhausting your cognitive fuel before you've even begun. Let's look at what happens in the brain. Upon waking, Lee, your brain is in a heightened state of neuroplasticity. Neural circuits are more sensitive, more primed for encoding, Lee, and more likely to adapt based on what you expose them to. This is a prime window to train focus, establish calm, and reinforce intentionality. Lee, but if the first thing you do is scroll, tap, check, swipe, you're not choosing what to focus on, you're letting a machine dictate it. You activate the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which is attuned to novelty, urgency, and potential threat. This shifts your brain into a reactive mode, the increasing cortisol and diminishing activity in the prefrontal cortex, the very area responsible for decision-making, goal management, and focus. Lee, now contrast that with an intentional digital fast during the early part of your week. When you delay exposure to digital inputs even by 30 to 60 minutes, you allow your brain's attentional systems to stabilize. You preserve what's known as your attentional reservoir. This reservoir is finite. It depletes every time you shift context or respond to a stimulus. The more you protect it, the more you can use it deliberately across the day. This is not about productivity for its own sake. Lee, it's about giving your brain the space to decide what matters before the world tells it what to react to. Neuroscience has shown that high-frequency digital consumption, especially early in the day, is associated with increased attentional switching, lower working memory scores, and greater emotional reactivity. The more random input you allow in, the more your brain learns to expect it and eventually crave it. This rewires your dopaminergic system toward short-term unpredictable rewards, making it harder to focus on deep work, long-term goals, or any activity that doesn't provide instant feedback. Instead, imagine starting your week by protecting your sensory field. No phone, no email, no passive content, just movement, breath, light hydration, and thought. This minimalist environment tells the brain, we are in control, we are not prey, and we are choosing our targets. As the week builds, that clarity compounds. Lee, you're less likely to get pulled off track because your attentional circuits were trained to resist chaos from the start. This is not discipline in the traditional sense, it's neuroprotection. Lee, it's about defending your cognitive energy from being drained by unpredictability and noise. Every alert you don't check, every notification you ignore early in the day is a vote for neural clarity. You're preserving the very systems that help you think deeply, decide wisely, and act consistently throughout the week. The human brain is fundamentally a predictive system. It doesn't just react to the present, it constantly forecasts what's about to happen based on patterns. When you create weekly recalibration rituals, specific times to pause, reflect, adjust, and recommit, you're not just organizing your life. You are actively training your brain to become more efficient at anticipating success and sustaining momentum. These rituals don't have to be complex. What matters is consistency. When you sit down at the same time, on the same day each week, to assess what went right, what derailed you, and what needs to shift, you activate the anterior cingulate cortex and the prefrontal cortex. These regions manage error detection, adaptive behavior, and future planning. They allow the brain to course correct by encoding not just what happened, but what to do differently next time, over repeated cycles. These reflections create neural scaffolding that sharpens decision-making and increases emotional regulation. The key is that you're closing feedback loops. The brain thrives on closed loops. It wants to know that actions lead to outcomes. That's where dopamine comes in. When you review the previous week and spot even small wins, behaviors completed, focus maintained, goals progressed, you create dopamine spikes associated with self-monitoring and improvement. The more often you reinforce this internal feedback, the more your brain learns that consistent effort equals consistent reward. This converts your nervous system from a reactive engine into a predictive machine. From a neurochemical standpoint, this also impacts your baseline. Many people chase progress but never feel satisfied because their reward systems are externally driven, likes, comments, validation, or deadlines. But when you implement a weekly self-check that emphasizes internal reward, where you recognize your own effort, you trigger dopamine in a more sustainable, internally controlled way. Over time, this reduces dependency on external stimuli and builds intrinsic motivation circuits. Just as importantly, these recalibration rituals reduce cognitive load. Instead of carrying a vague sense of stress, loose ends, and unfinished tasks, the brain gets a structured container. You offload the chaos onto a page, a journal, or a checklist, and that act of externalization calms the nervous system. It increases prefrontal coherence, reduces sympathetic arousal, and brings clarity to where your energy should go next. In essence, you're building a closed-loop behavioral system. Every week has a beginning, middle, and end. The end point, your recalibration ritual, signals to the brain that learning has occurred. This strengthens memory consolidation, primes the system for better decisions the following week, and makes each cycle feel purposeful. The predictability of this rhythm allows the brain to reduce threat detection and increase forward planning. And with each repetition, your brain becomes more efficient at optimizing effort, predicting reward, and suppressing distraction. You're not just progressing, you're wiring your system to expect progress. And when that happens, discipline stops feeling like pressure. It starts feeling like momentum. When you begin your week with structure, sunlight movement, focused intention, and a clear recalibration ritual, you're not just building better habits, you're actively reshaping your brain. You're leveraging biology, not relying on willpower. Each deliberate act signals safety, clarity, and reward to your nervous system, creating a foundation for sustained focus and long-term progress. You stop living in reaction mode and start operating as a predictive, high-efficiency system. This is how elite consistency is built, not through intensity, but through rhythm, and it all begins with how you start your week.